Thank you for tuning in to a very special edition of Beyond the Darkness. We've dug deep into our archives to pick our favorite True Crime Tuesday episodes of years gone by. Today's episode, Who Took Johnny, is probably one of the most compelling and chilling true crime stories. We wanted to revisit this because it's been a few years since anybody's heard it, and those of you now following Beyond the Darkness, this may be brand new to you. We hope that you enjoy it, and remember, if you like what you hear, you can subscribe to True Crime Tuesday, our ongoing podcast. Every Tuesday, a brand new 90 to 120-minute episode is available to you. Those episodes, $5 a month. That's only $1.25 per episode to get the best in true crime talk radio. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy a classic from our archives. This is Who Took Johnny. And welcome. This is Darkness Radio on a True Crime Tuesday. Tim, a few weeks back, I had the luxury of kicking back for a few hours to watch a documentary that was brought to my attention. Who Took Johnny is the name of the documentary. And I'm always fascinated, as you know, by true crimes and what's going on. That's why we started doing the show and kind of getting into the minds of people and why crimes take place, how victims are selected, what goes on. And this story of Johnny Gosch is one of the most chilling and heart-wrenching stories I've ever heard on so many levels. Why this is not getting more press like the Stephen Avery case, I guess, maybe because it's a 30-year cold case. But this, as a parent, as somebody that loves children, anybody out there listening, they should know about this story. They should know about this case. They should understand what's going on. And it is a dark, twisted pathway you take in this story. Abduction of children is one of the worst crimes I can think of, period.
Yeah.
Stealing the innocence of children, whether murdering them, sexually molesting, whatever goes on. But tonight we're going to talk about this case and the very bizarre twists and turns that it takes. This had me riveted. I was blown away by the way the story unfolded, by the things and the people involved in this story. And I can't recommend it enough. If you are a true crime fan, you need to watch this documentary. If you are a person with children in your life, aunts, uncles, moms, dads, grandpas, grandmas, you should watch this movie. My children will be returning in September. I plan on sitting down with them and showing them this movie, which is going to be hard for all of us. But in this day and age, when you try to warn your children of the dangers of going off by themselves, wandering into the woods, wandering off, they look at you like we did, roll your eyes. When we were kids, though, Tim, it was a different time. It was a different era. We could do this without that fear.
Right.
I mean, it was still out there. Kids were being abducted, obviously, like Johnny Gosch. That's from our time era.
Yep.
Okay. So we're not so far removed from this story, but it was a different time. It was a different feeling. And now when you try to talk to kids about it, they just don't understand it, and they don't realize the true jeopardy of what these cases entail. And I thought abduction and the death of your child would be the worst thing you could possibly imagine. This story takes you to darker places. So we're going to talk about it tonight, but this is also a documentary you need to see. You need to see the people. You need to hear from the witnesses. You need to see his mother. You need to know what's going on because it's that impactful. And I'm very serious about this. And as a matter of fact, I try to get them on with me in Coast to Coast when I can as well in the future, because I think the world really needs to hear about this. This is a very real thing that I don't think has gone away at all. So we're going to discuss all that, batten down the hatches, maybe put the kids to bed right now, and get ready to tune in and listen to this, because I want your undivided attention. I think everybody's going to learn some very interesting facts and things that they need to know about their own lives tonight. Joining us this evening is David Bellinson. He is one of the writers, directors, and producers of the documentary Who Took Johnny. David, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be on with you.
What drew you to this story in this case?
Well, specifically, we, back in 2002, we had made a film, my partners and I, called Horns and Halos, which was for HBO. It was a documentary about a publisher who had lived in a basement in New York and put out a book about George W. Bush during the 2000 campaign, and it was about him and the author putting the book out. And we had shown it at HBO, and we had a screening there, and a bunch of people came to the screening, and an author, a journalist by the name of Nick Bryant, who was working on a story about Johnny and about sort of child trafficking, watched the film and said to us, well, if you think you've got a good film, I've got a story to tell you. And, I developed a relationship with Nick, and he talked to us about Johnny's story, and I sort of just became fascinated by the idea of Johnny Gosch, the sort of first missing kid on a milk carton, and what happened to him. And I became intrigued by the story of his mother, who is sort of a remarkable person, and thought, there's a story here, especially something that's, been covered so much in the media over the years that often makes for good fodder for us, because you've got material, you've got archival material, and when you can wrap your head around a personal story, in this case, a mother looking for her son, which is a sort of seemingly universal tale, those tend to be good sort of backdrops for films, good narratives.
Did you have any idea how dark this story really was when you two took this task on?
No, I did not. And in fact, oftentimes with our films, if we really knew how long they would take to make and how deep we would get, we probably wouldn't start them. So no, I didn't know much about his story. I also didn't know much about sort of the history of how missing kids are dealt with, both in law enforcement, media, from a cultural perspective. I didn't understand just the way law enforcement deals with missing children, like the way statistics are calculated, the way the numbers are tabulated, the way law enforcement sort of deals with them, the history of laws and how laws are dealt with. It was a sort of eye-opening experience and a window into a world, frankly, that most people just don't pay attention to. We care more about, the FBI can tell you how many cars are stolen, how many Toyotas are stolen, how many are stolen across state lines, but they have a very difficult time putting an exact number on, the kids who go missing that are trafficked. We just don't know those numbers.
Explain for our listeners, we even play the promo here on our station talking about trafficking. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. Can you give us kind of a breakdown? What does it mean when you talk about human trafficking? I mean, a lot of us believe that it's just the abduction of children that are taken out of the country, or people, women, children that are taken off to other countries. I don't think that's necessarily the truth in total. What do you know about it, and what can you share with us?
Yeah, I try and come from it, as someone who's not a particular expert in one field. I try and put a peg on certain areas of it. And one element that I always sort of look for is things are the money, the economics of it. So, children, be it kids who are abducted, kids who are runaways, kids who are abused, are often used and manipulated. And the sort of trafficked aspect, relates to literally a kid becoming a prostitute, and a pimp or a panderer takes the kid across state lines, to everything from kids who are taken and flown overseas, kids who are brought here. I think you could look this up, but I'm pretty sure that the Justice Department states that the largest single child trafficking sort of event is the Super Bowl every year. Every year, whatever city the Super Bowl is in, prostitutes are sort of flown all over the country and brought to that city. Now, that says a lot about a lot of different things. But I think the irony of it is, America's greatest pastime, the largest single television event in the world, is also sort of the backdrop for one of the darkest, most disturbing aspects of society that, frankly, we just don't like to talk about. It's easier to talk about murders than it is to talk about missing and exploited children. And sort of that's a sort of, a difficult thing to come to grips with when you sort of start looking into this. It's easy to turn the other cheek.
This type of crime, the idea of an abducted child, I mean, that's, to me, terrifying as a parent. As an uncle, as a friend of people that have children, the idea of a child going missing, I mean, you automatically go to the worst case scenario, which I always thought was death. We'll talk deeper into this as the story unfolds, but talk us through Johnny Gosch's life and who this little boy was and what happened to him that fateful day.
Yeah, so Johnny, was Midwestern kid, born and raised. They lived in West Des Moines, Iowa, with his mother, Noreen, and his father, John Gosch Sr. And a typical kid growing up in the late 70s, early 80s, loved sports, did karate, and did a paper route like a lot of other kids did. It's hard to believe now, if you have kids or if you're young, that parents would let kids go out at 5 a.m. at 9, 10 years old and start delivering newspapers, but that's what kids did for money. And he wanted to save up to buy a motorbike, because he had an older stepbrother who had a motorcycle, and so he started a paper route. And he, 12 years old, the morning of September 4th, 1982, he was off on his paper route and didn't come home. And probably about an hour after he had left to start his paper route, the Gosches started getting phone calls from neighbors saying, "Hey, where's my paper? What happened?" So they instantly knew something was wrong and ran out. And a few blocks away from his house, along his paper route, they found his sort of red flyer wagon where he had left his newspapers. They found the unbundled newspapers that hadn't even been bundled. And his dog had come home. So they saw the dog at home and then went to a few blocks away to see the wagon was sitting there. And that's sort of when, I guess, everything changed, you could say.
Now, the tragedy of this aspect of the story is, as I understand it, his father would accompany him all the time for this paper route. Is that right?
Yeah, the father was with him all the time, and this was a morning when he wasn't there. Johnny said, "Oh, I'm fine, I'm old enough, I'm going to go do it by myself, and come meet me after." So he was alone, unfortunately, and there's a lot of speculation as to that, being alone, not being alone. Instantly Noreen and John Gosch Sr. started calling the neighbors. They called police. But one of the difficult things about the story is that at the time, we didn't have Amber Alerts. There was no National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There was no America's Most Wanted. It was not, missing kids is not what we think of now as missing kids in terms of how people react to them. Oftentimes it's runaways. Oh, those kids will be back. This was a police department, the West Des Moines Police Department. It wasn't even the Des Moines Police Department. It was West Des Moines, that I think had 35 police officers at the time, 38 police officers. So it wasn't a big department, wasn't a lot of resources, and they weren't able to sort of hit the ground running like you might today if you're abducted or go missing in a big city. And so that, for us, and we could, sort of trace the story as it goes further. I think that was as interesting to us, the story of Johnny's disappearance and his mother, as much as it was against the backdrop of sort of Americana and culture and how things were dealt with at that time, which, even though it's only a little over 30 years ago, are very different than how we deal with it now. Right.
You've got this boy goes missing. When they initially report him missing to the minute the police really start to take this serious is what kind of time frame?
Yeah, so I think it was at least a few days before anything sort of serious happened in terms of calling the FBI, doing search parties, getting people out, and a lot of that was driven by Noreen and John Gosch Sr. To this day, Johnny Gosch is considered a missing person. It's not considered a criminal case in the sense that there's no. law enforcement, the police are dealing with it, but they don't consider him to be abducted. They still consider him a missing person. So,
And how old was he? How old was he when he vanished?
He was 12.
12 years old. Right.
He was 12 years old. And if you believe the theory, well, maybe he ran away. Well, why would he leave his newspapers? Why would he leave his dog? What's the impetus for a 12-year-old to just run away?
And then follow that up with
those circumstances.
Right. And then you follow up that aspect with he's 12 years old. Where is he going to go on the run and take care of himself for many years? I mean, to think that the law enforcement officials would look at it as just a runaway or a missing person as opposed to something nefarious going on, that's what baffles me.
Right. And it's hard. It's hard to second guess. I mean, we've done a lot of projects with law enforcement. I have the utmost respect for law enforcement. Every situation is different.
Right.
As a lay person, as a sort of civilian, it's easy to sort of think what you would do. But law enforcement, they do have rules to go by. They do have sort of protocol that they have to work with, and according to their protocol, they felt that they had no evidence, and they still feel to this day that they have no evidence to definitively prove otherwise that he was abducted or that there was some organized effort to take him.
Right, and I'm not trying to put an attack on law enforcement either on this, but it's...
No. Of
right.
course, but you can be frustrated. It's very frustrating.
Right.
As a parent, as someone, you think, like, come on, do something. It's easy to get frustrated by it.
Right, and you look at this case, in point again. This wasn't a kid who was adept at hunting and survival tactics. So to think that a 12-year-old could just go off on their own and make it, and that at no point did they really start to look at it as something other than just a runaway is what baffles me. That to this day he's still just considered a missing person.
Right.
Did the speculation and spotlight turn on Johnny's parents at all?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there were, just to backtrack, there were witnesses that morning. There were other kids and a parent who were delivering papers that had seen Johnny talking to two men, had seen two men walking down the street. So talking to those witnesses and understanding that Noreen and John Gosch Sr. knew immediately something was up, that there was just no way, based on where the wagon was found at the end of this cul-de-sac, that it seemed like a trap. It seemed like something had been set. Or that something was amiss here. And so they, were screaming, and screaming is the wrong word, but, voraciously, asking for help, pleading for help. And so I think, you had a lot of times, it's hard for us to sort of understand what is a parent who's in that situation going through. How does a parent react to that? We've seen other abductions, and other cases where we've seen parents, they don't talk to anybody. They don't want to talk to the media. They go into their shell. It affects them in a different way, understandably, and they just can't be overt about it. Noreen especially became the opposite. She became, overtly critical of police, overtly critical of the situation, basically would hold press conferences and sort of take charge of the situation, saying, if I'm not looking for my kid, no one else is looking for my kid. I've got to be my kid's own advocate. The police can only do so much. So she took on a very vocal role. And I think, frankly, again, this speaks to the time frame, this speaks to the era, this speaks to the culture. I think for some people, frankly, it rubbed them the wrong way. They just thought, who is this mother ranting and raving? And obviously, as someone who, if it happened to you, you'd think you'd search the ends of the earth, you'd tear up the earth to find your kid. So it's easy to understand why she became so vocal and so angry. And yet, some people, they just didn't like that. It's also, it took the attention to her. And so people thought, oh, well, she's making the attention about her. So Noreen, both then and through now, in particular, because John was a lot more reserved than her, has taken a lot of flack over how she's sort of handled Johnny's case, how she's advocated for him. And that became a very big part of our story, Noreen's own mission, her own quest, her own search. And so, it's very hard to see, especially when you look at some of the archival footages in the film of sort of how she was treated then and what they were doing. I mean, they went on the Today Show and gave their home phone number on the Today Show, telling people, call us. They're on with Jane Pauley. I mean, you would never see something like that happen today.
Did she feel at any time that her son was dead? Did they ever seem to give up hope with this case?
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of times that they thought, he's dead, you're not here, we don't know. And yet, sort of, as you see in the film, and if you research the story, from the time he went missing up and through recently, there have been little things that have happened that have given Noreen hope or an understanding that something else might have happened. So I think it's been a constant struggle for her over the years to understand, what happened to him from then through now.
Who took Johnny? Our guest this evening, David Bellinson. We're going to continue talking about this tragic case and the story that unfolds with missing paperboy Johnny Gosch. We'll do that when we return to True Crime Tuesday. Our guest this evening is one of the writers, directors, and producers of this documentary. You took this story on in what year?
Well, we first had sort of discovered the story or been turned on to the story back in 2002. Mm-hmm. And, amongst all of our other projects, you're always trying to figure out how to get a project off the ground, get financing, and otherwise. We sort of always kept it in the back of our head, thinking about how we were going to make it. And then in 2011, I was having a meeting at NBC, and I said, next year is the 30th anniversary of the first missing kid on a paper cart, the first missing kid to appear on the side of a milk carton. I said, it's an incredible story of what's happened to him. And they became really intrigued, and we decided, okay, they would help us produce a special for that, which was called Missing Johnny. And it's a short, it's like a 45-minute, 1-hour TV sort of special that aired in conjunction with the 30th anniversary. But like a lot of things on television, there's not enough time to always tell the best story or tell the longest story. So they agreed to let us make sort of a director's cut of the film, which in turn became, twice as long as that piece, about 85 minutes. I think it is 86 minutes now. And that became the film Who Took Johnny, which has a ton of material that's not in there, and it sort of allows us to take the story to another level. And it also includes in it when we went down to shoot with Noreen in that summer, the summer of 2012. And while we were there in West Des Moines, 2 young girls had been abducted. And needless to say, it was strikingly eerie and sort of a weird coincidence. And Noreen was called in to sort of help them, console them, give them advice. And we thought, wow, what an amazing sort of parallel here. 30 years after Johnny's abduction, it's sort of all come full circle, and you've got Noreen, who's going through the same situation these young parents were going through. Now, 30 years later, and sort of using her wisdom, using her experience to sort of teach them how to be an advocate for their kids. Because, so often with law enforcement, especially when anything happens, we just assume, okay, they'll take care of it. And it's hard, but the parents do have a role, and not everyone can sort of take that on. And I think that's what's been so incredible about Johnny's mother, Noreen, is that she did. She not only became an advocate for Johnny, she became an advocate for any parent who's dealing with the situation.
When she was confronted with this, a lot of families we see have fallen apart when there's a loss of a child. What was it like for Johnny's parents during this time, and did they have any other children, or was Johnny their sole child?
Yeah, no. Johnny was the sole child with Noreen and John Gosch, but Noreen has 2 older children from a prior marriage. Her husband had passed away. But she has purposely since then and even through now kept them completely out of the spotlight. Like, many people didn't even know she had other kids. Certainly they don't know their names or who they are. And that was out of both sort of just motherly protection, and just keeping them away from it for all the sort of obvious reasons. But the situation, the disappearance of Johnny was a major, point of stress in their lives. Especially, personality wise, John is more reserved. Johnny's father was more reserved, and sort of quiet, and Noreen became very outspoken, and sort of led the charge. And I think it consumed her like it would consume anybody, and I think ultimately sort of tore them apart. They eventually, I 13 years later, got divorced. So they've been divorced, I think, since 93 or 94. So needless to say, it was very difficult on their marriage.
You brought up the milk carton aspect, which is fascinating. I mean, all of us from that time period remember when children's photographs started appearing on milk cartons. And I think it was a brilliant campaign, but a very short-lived, only like 2 or 3 years that kind of campaign went on because there were too many complaints. It was depressing people and scaring children as they're sitting there eating their breakfast cereal to see missing children and see the stories on the carton, which in hindsight seems like too bad. Maybe that's what we should be doing is making people more aware. But he was one of the very first people to be featured on the milk carton. And how did that come about?
Yeah, it was pretty, from the time he was, he disappeared, kidnapped in 1982. It's sort of, Noreen did a great job of bringing, his story and the idea of missing kids into the spotlight. So, you had posters, you had the idea of missing flyers, they were putting up billboards everywhere. And then 2 years and a couple months from the time that Johnny disappeared, another local paperboy, Eugene Martin, disappeared one day. So that's sort of one of the twists in the stories that sort of, gives you goosebumps when you think about it, that 2 years later, another local paperboy disappeared and has never been seen from again.
On and around, or was it on the exact same date or like within that
No,
same
I think it was within, I forgot the exact same date. It was 2 years later, within a month or so from when Johnny disappeared. I believe Eugene's it was either at the end of September or August. I have to look at my dates, but it was around the same time 2 years later. And needless to say, it completely rocked the community of Des Moines. It rocked the police department because they were not prepared for it, were sort of thought it was unfathomable. And everybody was sort of in full force trying to find him, trying to figure out what was going on. And one of Eugene Martin's relatives, worked at the Anderson Erickson Dairy, which is the big dairy in Des Moines. And they're actually a pretty innovative dairy in the country, doing some really cool things with yogurt and packaging and otherwise. So it's family run, really smart guy who runs it. And he said, every day at the dinner, at the breakfast table, kids are, have their milk out.
Right.
A milk carton is a great, like you said, is a great sort of billboard to do this. So, if we can help, sort of spread the word and do our part, let's do that. So let's print out some milk cartons. It started in the Midwest. They put Eugene and Johnny, and they went to putting up other kids on the milk cartons, and it sort of spread from community to community. And then, like you said, took off for a few years all over the country. They were putting kids on milk cartons. That was how it started.
Right, and that started to spread the word on it. Were they getting responses from the milk carton postings? Was it doing any good?
Oh yeah. I mean, there are stories of kids who've been found from it. Other kids, and I think that when you see it in the film, that's sort of one of the difficult things about the case is that it got so much attention, and Noreen did such a good job of exposing the story and getting out in the media that they were getting tons of tips. They were getting tons of calls from people. Oh, I saw this person, or I saw him here, or there were all these clues that were turned in by people who saying they'd seen someone who looked like Johnny. There was a dollar bill that someone found in Kansas City that was printed on it, "I am Johnny Gosch, I am alive." That was given to Noreen. Phone calls that she'd gotten.
Now, when that was a pretty chilling aspect too. When this dollar bill surfaces with "I am Johnny Gosch, I am alive," were they able to do any kind of handwriting analysis? Does it match up with any known writings?
They did. I mean, it was tough for us to go back and look at any records, but law enforcement did do sort of basic handwriting analysis and thought that it looked similar to some stuff they'd seen of Johnny. And it was taken seriously enough that Senator Grassley and now I can't think of the other longtime Iowa senator's name, Harkin and Grassley, both held press conferences saying we got to do something about this. This is, they found the dollar bill in Kansas City, so that means it's not in Iowa. That means it's a federal. If it's interstate, kidnapping or trafficking, and that's when they sort of tried to bring it, and make it a big deal at the FBI and sort of a big state case. But that's one of many sort of weird twists and clues that it's hard to prove either way.
And how long after his disappearance did that dollar bill surface?
3 years, 1985.
So again, you think that the most horrific part of the story is your child goes missing and you automatically begin to think they're dead. They've been murdered, and you've got to go through that grieving process of feeling that horrific loss, and then to keep getting these little glimmers of hope, these little moments of light where, yeah, I think I saw Johnny, or this dollar bill shows up. That's got to rebuild you only to bring you back down again when nothing else happens. And you start to wonder, Who Took Johnny is the documentary we're talking about. I have a link up to our guest's website. If you go to darknessradio.com, click on the True Crime tab, you'll find information about David Bellinson there, his production company, and the work he does, and you'll find ways to watch Who Took Johnny. I highly recommend you watch this with you and your family. Educate yourself, enlighten yourself. This case may be 30 years cold, but there are very important lessons that need to be learned right now. Once Johnny vanished and this search went on, I mean, was there a pretty hardcore search going on for 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, a year, or was it kind of a flashbang? There was this, and then now we've got to get back to new crimes and focusing on trying to solve that.
Yeah, I think for the first 3 months it was pretty intense, and sort of stayed that way. And then basically, the police sort of, local law enforcement had to sort of put their attention elsewhere. Like I said, it was a small police department, West Des Moines. I think there were 39, 40 officers at the time, dealing with other things. And so Noreen took it upon herself to hire private investigators, and basically sort of run the investigation on her own. Were
they helpful at all?
Yeah, I think they were helpful. I think, the investigators turned her on to the idea that maybe there was something organized about this. I mean, when a kid goes missing against their own will, there's a handful of scenarios that happen. A family member takes them, someone who knows them who's not a family member takes them, some sort of lone wolf type person takes them, or there's something that's organized. And when I say organized, I mean more than one person, something that's planned and coordinated, organized kidnapping, organized trafficking. And so they basically, turned her on to the possibility that those things do exist, and that those were the sort of leads that they needed to follow up on. Who are the people that could have been responsible for this? Where do kids like Johnny, if they're taken, end up? How does the trafficking network work? And sort of that opened up a Pandora's box for Maureen that she's never quite been able to close since then, which is that many kids who do go missing end up being pandered and trafficked.
And this is, again, where it takes even darker a turn, because it's one thing to mourn the death of your child and try to move on with your life, but then to open up to the possibility that your child is being sexually exploited, molested, hurt, that is beyond comprehension. I don't know how people keep their sanity when that aspect of this is presented to them. There would be these sightings of Johnny, these kind of mysterious sightings. Was there ever any video footage or anything to back up that might have actually been Johnny?
No, I mean, Noreen, not that we know of. I mean, Noreen had gotten phone calls in the middle of the night, strange phone calls that she felt were Johnny or sounded like Johnny. There were sightings. When
she would get Johnny. These calls, what would they say? What was being done?
I mean, there was one call she got where she said there was a voice in the line that sounded like Johnny that sounded soft and weak, saying, "Help me, help me." And whether it was someone playing a prank or whether it was him, I mean, that's disturbing. That's a difficult thing to accept.
Right.
There were sightings that they were basically all over the country, but particularly the Midwest, of people. I mean, there was a sighting, I think it would have been a couple years later, where a woman claimed that a kid who fit Johnny's description ran up to her in a parking lot saying, "Please help me, help me." And then she told police the kid was dragged into a van, and they sped off. So again, whether that was really Johnny, a prank, or another kid who was in trouble, it was a real woman who did go to police and said that she witnessed that. That's, a pretty remarkable sort of event to sort of witness, whether it was him or not. And there's a whole host of things like that have sort of been reported on over the years that, begs you to ask the question, which is, well, is Johnny still alive and out there and part of this, or is this just, the greatest hoax on earth, or rather the greatest fodder for hoaxers? Are people really, so obsessed with this case that they want to fool Marine and fool law enforcement and, play pranks on everybody?
And it's terrifying of an aspect of humanity to say that we'd like to believe that doesn't happen. But it does. And that was in the time when not only was she putting her phone number on TV, but you could look in the white pages to find how to contact people. And there are just some sick people out there who take pleasure in bringing misery to others.
Right.
Was there ever, because this case was never looked at as an abduction, was there ever any, besides his parents, any suspects in his disappearance at all? Or did they always just maintain, the police, that this is a runaway case?
No, I mean, there were, local drifters here and there. There were guys, they had thought at some point, and I think there's still evidence that police were looking into a serial killer at the time for some unexplained murders that had happened in the Midwest. There was a member of the Hells Angels at the time who came forward to police to say that he helped guard a kid who had been, was being used as a sort of sex slave for a bunch of gangs at the time, and helped transported a bunch of kids who were prostitutes, and said Johnny Gosch was one of them. And, there's just sort of story after story that, sort of opened up this nefarious underworld window into things that either make you think something was going on in the Johnny case, or just make you think, wow, there's a lot of really weird, crazy stuff happening out in the world.
Did these people
feel tangential to it?
Right. Like this Hell's Angel, did he explain why it took him so long to come forward? What about it? I mean, obviously, he's a Hell's Angel and doesn't want to piss people off.
It was at the time. It was, I think, like in 85 or 86, had said he was helping transport kids around that time. And, meaning at the time, not in 1982, but in 1986. So it would have been a few years after Johnny had been kidnapped. The theory would have been he was part of a traveling group of kids who were abducted, and, these guys were helping transporting them.
Well, and I think what people were having issues and have a hard time understanding is if he's being sighted and he's being seen out by himself in these places, well, then he must be a runaway, because if you were an abducted child or you're being forced into this prostitution ring, you just run.
Right.
But it's
Although
not that simple.
We know from other cases that just doesn't happen. I mean, look at J.C. Dugard. Look at these girls in Ohio. I mean, there have been cases of kids who've been kidnapped, forced to live with their abductor, have had children with the abductor, have helped raise kids, in these environments, and have had opportunities to escape and haven't. So whether it's a form of sort of mental abuse, whether it's this fear that's been ingrained in someone, we've seen it in other cases. I mean, there's a Sean Hornbeck, if you Google the Sean Hornbeck case, was a kid who another kid helped kidnap him. And they lived together for 3 years. He went to school and had a girlfriend, played video games with these guys, and then realized, hey, I want to go home now. So there are examples of these cases. There are examples of kids who've been kidnapped, who've had the opportunity to run away, but haven't. So it's tough to make those judgments. It seems so obvious that, of course, if it happens to you, you do something about it. But it's hard in that situation to sort of understand, based on whatever trauma might have occurred, how you might react.
Who Took Johnny? That's the documentary we're discussing tonight. David Bellinson, one of the writers, producers, directors of this documentary, as we talk about the mysterious sightings, strange clues, bizarre revelations, and a confrontation with a person who claims to have helped abduct Johnny. We're going to talk about that aspect of the story and so much more when we return. And has anyone ever heard from Johnny Gosch? Has he ever reached out besides that one single dollar bill with a signature scrawled across it? Stay tuned to find out more of that information when we return. back. This is Darkness Radio on a True Crime Tuesday. For any of you just tuning in case you've missed, a few weeks back I caught a documentary called Who Took Johnny, which in my opinion is one of the most compelling documentaries of true crime I've ever seen. It is enthralling, it is frightening, and definitely educational. As a father myself, this was a documentary that when I saw it impacted me in ways I didn't expect and opened up my eyes to a real trend, a horrific trend that's gone on that a lot of us have turned a blind eye to. When we hear about a child going missing, unfortunately nowadays our thoughts turn to the parents probably had a hand in it because we've seen this play out in stories over and over again. Or they're just abducted and missing and we never hear from them again. And it's always assumed that these children are probably dead, that they're probably gone now, which is heart-rending enough. That is something that as a parent worries you from the moment you find out you're going to be a parent to the moment you pass away on your deathbed, is that concern and worry for your child to keep them safe. There's an alarming number, Tim, of missing children that on a daily basis. And you think, how is this even possible that this many children in this day and age can continue to go missing? There was video footage about a week or so ago of a mother, and she was in like a dry cleaner, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And she's standing there, and her little 4-year-old kid is kind of wandering around by the door. And the video surveillance shows us, suddenly the door just opens and a person grabs the kid and starts to run. Right there, in a shop. Luckily, the kid let out a howl, the mom turned around, and they were able to get the kid back immediately. Mm. But that's the kind of balls people have, that right there in the open, during daylight, they will just open a door, yank a kid out of a store, and make a run for it. And again, you think the worst possible scenario is that your child ends up dead. And now I don't think that's necessarily the worst of it.
No.
As a parent, the idea of your child being abducted and trafficked for any purpose, abused physically, mentally, sexually, that to me is even more disturbing. And was when you start looking into this, David, our guest, David Bellinson, the director,
Yep.
producer, and writer, when you start to look into that aspect, was there ever a point where you're like, wow, what have we uncorked? What is this story really turning out to be?
Well, I think, again, I try and, there's some things that are so subjective it's hard to figure out, so I try and find the objective sort of angle. And we started researching statistics on missing kids. You just look at the numbers. Of the numbers of kids who go missing every year, certainly a large number are found. They're runaways, they're short-term kids lost, they're divorce situations. And then there are a whole bunch of kids, the percentages vary, that you just never hear from again. So, like you said earlier, is it that they run away and start new identities? I don't know. Are they all, if they're killed and murdered by someone, we'd probably be finding them. And the other scenario, which is a likely scenario, is that they're trafficked. And you look at the numbers. It's supply and demand. If you think about, the desire for kids, that sort of being a pedophile and being sexually attracted to kids, doctors, people will tell you that it's a percentage of the population, maybe 1 out of 100. Some percentage thereof are physically attracted to minors. Well, if that's the case, how do they deal with that? Certainly, there are people who deal with it through molestation, other kind of things that they do. But like an adult or otherwise, if you have the resources and you're, let's say, wealthy, you probably pay someone else to do it for you, the same way you pay an escort agency to send you an escort, or you deal with a pimp for a prostitute or anything else. How does it work if you are attracted to someone who's underage? Someone has to go do it for you. More often than not, those are children who are forced to do it. And that's when you get into child trafficking. So yes, it's very scary. It still is. And it's difficult because you want to sort of turn away as a parent, as just a decent human being. You don't like to think about these things. Like I said, sometimes it's easier to think of, frankly, someone being murdered or something that is seemingly dark and difficult than it is to think about, sexually abusing a child.
I know in the news there was recently some hubbub of this one company that was considering creating child sex dolls. And there was this big hype about it of, will this help curb the appetite of child molesters? If they have something to take that frustration out and they can choose and pick what they want and how they want it, will that be enough? Or will that just inspire a whole new generation of pedophiles that may go from wanting the doll to something more real? And it's a terrifying aspect. Do you think, as a parent, how can anyone be attracted to a child, and why, and to what end? And is it just the fact that they're a child, or that they're easy to manipulate, they're easy to control? Either way, I mean, it's an absolutely chilling aspect. And when Noreen Gosch started to consider that aspect, can you talk to me a little bit about what was her perception at that moment? Did that fire her up even more to find Johnny, or how did that impact her?
I think initially it scared her. I think anybody who doesn't think about that stuff, know about it, read about it, pay attention to, doesn't think it exists, doesn't think that child trafficking exists, doesn't think that there are that there's organized pedophiles, that there's anything that's sort of organized or seemingly nefarious in that world. And once you start realizing that it exists, I mean, I challenge all your listeners, I challenge anybody who's listening out here to just pay attention. Every day, when you read a newspaper and watch the news and read stories, you're going to come across these stories all the time. But you end up just skipping down to the lower end of the page, or you end up scrolling up, above the fold on your browser, because you just don't want to deal with it. And I think that that's what Noreen sort of, realized, is that, hey, there's this whole world, there's this whole sort of underworld of this stuff going on, and nobody really wants to pay attention to it. And I think that's what fired her up, thinking like, hey, it happened to my son. It could be happening to your son and daughters out there. Doesn't someone want to do something about it? I mean, she always says, and she says oftentimes in the film, if I'm not fighting for my kid, who else is fighting for him? And how does the government, frankly, how do we treat, as the Constitution, how do our laws treat the civil rights of minors, of kids who are sort of abused, who can't fight for themselves? What happens?
He goes missing, Johnny Gosch. There are these strange sightings, strange clues, aside from the dollar bill and some reported sightings. What were some of the other strange or bizarre revelations that started to unfold?
Yeah. So I think the biggest revelation, the sort of aha moment in the case, came about 10 years after he was abducted, after he went missing, rather. And a young man came forward and told police that he actually helped kidnap Johnny when he was younger. And he recounted this tale of being there that morning, helping to lure Johnny into this car, and helping to ingrain him into this world of kids who are trafficked. And nobody believed him. Law enforcement didn't believe him. Noreen believed him. Some private investigators believed him. But the story seemed so implausible. And the sort of connection to it. I don't know if I'm jumping too far ahead.
No. This is
I get into it at this point or not.
Yeah, this is a fascinating aspect. If there's something that you feel that we might, I mean, this story is so big.
I know.
It's hard to try to grab apart and run with it without fear of leaving something out before we get into this, because that is one of the most bizarre aspects of this case, and it becomes even more chilling. Was there another point prior to that we should mention to kind of bring us up to that, or do you feel we're ready to move on with this section?
Yeah, I mean, there was, from 82 until about, I guess it was 92 or 93, there were a whole host of sort of weird things that happened, from getting this dollar bill that was supposedly signed by Johnny that they were found, to sightings of him, to Noreen getting weird phone calls. There was a whole sort of range of events that happened that seemed really, really strange, that made her think, A, Johnny's probably still alive, and B, he was probably kidnapped by someone, and it was probably something organized. So Noreen had these ideas, had been publicizing, as he publicizing these ideas, had been telling everybody basically that was her theory. All basically falling on deaf ears. There was nothing that law enforcement could do about it other than try and follow her leads. There was no one really helping her with any of this. So she sort of, just kept continuing down that path of realizing, like, okay, if I'm going to keep going, I've got to assume that he's still alive, and that he's either in a situation where he can't get to me, or he's scared for his life, or he's being held against his will still constantly, that he can't get away. So you have to understand at this point, Noreen had sort of already had these thoughts in her head, and was pretty well convinced that was the case. And then, I would say, sort of jumping down the line in I think it was 91, actually, 91, 92, a man came forward named Paul Benassi, who told police, and he was in his 20s at the time, that when he was 16, 10 years earlier, he had helped kidnap Johnny. And Paul was a guy who was living outside of Omaha, which is actually not that far from Des Moines. It's a couple hours driving distance. And he said that, he was sort of being used by some older men to help, abduct and ingrain kids into being child prostitutes. But nobody believed him. And so that sort of became the sort of linchpin for this story, because Noreen believed him, believed his story, believed that he was involved, and yet law enforcement didn't. And law enforcement didn't even want to interview the guy.
Right, and that is so frustrating, right? I mean, here the mom is saying, listen, this guy knows something. He's not just...
He's the only person.
Right.
He's the only person to ever come forward in the case to state that he was directly involved in the case, and he's never been interviewed by Des Moines law enforcement.
Say that again. People need to hear that line. He's the only one that came forward, and...
He's the only person who's ever come forward and overtly stated that he was involved in Johnny's abduction. And he was never interviewed by West Des Moines police. Now, he was interviewed by law enforcement as it relates to an entirely different case of sort of this sort of exposure of these child prostitutes that happened in Omaha, Nebraska, about a few years earlier in the late 80s, early 90s. There was a scandal in Omaha called the Franklin scandal that a lot of people probably know about, where a bunch of kids came forward to say that they had been child prostitutes for some of the sort of wealthier and powerful guys in Omaha. And Paul was one of those guys. And essentially that case went down as, this opens up a whole other Pandora's box for
right.
listeners. We probably don't have another 3 hours to get into it. But basically that case was sort of squashed, and they said the kids were lying, that they weren't telling the truth, and that the kids were all putting on this hoax. So Paul had gotten this reputation as being someone who wasn't telling the truth then. Now, I think if you see the film and you hear his story, he does appear to be a believable person. Now, again, that's me just as an observer, as a filmmaker, talking about that. But I think, in a lot of true crime stories, they raise as many questions as they answer. And I think for us, the big sort of question that hasn't been able to be answered is, why would you not interview the guy? Even if you found him not trustworthy, why not interview him? I mean, law enforcement does that all the time. They interview guys who are bad witnesses. They interview the wrong people. They give people credence that shouldn't have credence. So it's always been very weird and seemingly off-putting that the one person in the case who claims that they were involved has never been interviewed by the local police department.
Now, again, for people to understand, to get some grasp of that, yes, everybody should theoretically be interviewed. There are so many people that come forward bearing false witness and false information that at some point the law enforcement officials just get to a point where they're just done.
Right.
But what's intriguing is, as you said, this is the only person who really came forward saying he was actually part of this.
Right, exactly. He wasn't offering clues or saying witnesses. He was saying, I was there. I did it.
I was there. I did it. And he actually was able to describe specific things about Johnny that were not part of the regular news stories.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of the skepticism of Paul is that, he was only telling police things that were public information. He could have looked it up. Mind you, people forget that, like, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was no Google. Like, certainly you could go to a local newspaper and look up old stories, but unless you were very dedicated to the con, conning someone, that's an unlikely scenario that you're going to go and go to microfiche files and try and figure out everything you can that was ever said about this case.
It's also important to realize that most confidence cases like this, most con men are looking for a financial angle or looking for something.
Right.
He wasn't looking to cash in. There was nothing for him to gain out of doing this.
In fact, it's the opposite. It only hurt his reputation and only made him seem, worse. So the only thing to gain from it was his own conscience, basically. And so, he told Noreen some things about Johnny that she claimed she'd never said publicly before, and she believed him. She at first hated him and wanted to, in her own words, sort of strangle the guy when she saw him, but she sort of came to feel sorry for him because, in this case, and like I said, we've seen it in other cases. You've seen it with the Sean Hornbeck case. You've seen it with other cases where, kids who are abused. So Paul had been abused, or tells a story of being physically abused, sexually abused from the time he was a kid, end up, doing it to other kids, end up, being involved and sort of helping coercing other kids. And so Noreen feels bad for him and had felt bad for him because she felt he was a victim as well, forced to do things against his own will. Again, for the layman, that's probably hard to believe. It's probably sort of hard to wrap your head around that. Who's going to force me to do anything? But, we've seen instances of this. It depends on how you grew up. It depends on the environment you've grown up in.
Well, and it depends on how they broke you down as well and what they put you through. And then one of the chilling aspects, kind of going down the rabbit hole after watching this documentary and reading and engrossing myself into some of this trafficking, is what some people, again, or what I would say 99% of the people don't realize, is sometimes these traffickers are so nefarious in the fact that what they do is they will force these victims' hands to do something horrific, whether it's helping to kidnap other children, whether it's raping or molesting other children, whether it's committing a murder. They're ingratiating kind of this person into their illicit fold. So now you can't go public, because if you go public, you're going down too, because we have you. We can put you at that spot for that murder, for that rape, for these things. And if they realize you helped us abduct more children, you're never going to get out of prison. And these people become, these children become so twisted by that logic, by that belief system, that they become indentured servants, that they can't break free from these imaginary bonds and chains because they're so afraid of what will happen when they come forward, if they come forward. Plus, it also goes deeper. Sometimes it's not just the things that they're threatening to put you away for. It's, if you go forward, we will kill your family. We will torture and rape your mother, your sister, your brother, your father. What we're doing to you will seem like nothing compared to what we're going to do to them.
Right.
And that's, again, opening up that Pandora's box. I got to tell you, David, it's been a couple of sleepless nights. Again, I think people need to educate themselves to the reality of what's going on there, and that we have to become a community again. We need to start watching each other's backs. We need to be alert. We need to be aware of what's going on with these children, these trafficked children, because they're not going to always appear like children that are in need or in immediate danger.
Absolutely. It's the apathy that allows, frankly, things to exist. And the people who are perpetrating this understand that. They understand. There's a term for it called throwaway kids. Once the kids are sort of used and abused, then they have no reputation. They're easy to sort of discard. Nobody's paying attention or caring. So unless you've got someone like Noreen, or you've got a loudmouth, overt, sort of aggressive mother or family member who's your advocate, who's going to fight for you, like a John Walsh or Johnny Gosch, your chances of survival are slim.
All right. This witness comes forward, opens up his soul, his mouth tells. This is a huge break in the case, a huge opening to get some answers and understand. Okay, maybe law enforcement is fatigued. Maybe they're overworked and there's too many new cases that are pressing, and there are new children going missing and new crimes that need to be taken, and police are being shot in the streets, and we need to focus on this right now instead of a 30-year cold case. You could even give him that aspect, because this is a shady guy with a shady past. And, believe it or not, folks, some people try to get themselves put in jail and prison because they prefer to be there.
Right.
And some criminals, career criminals that have been let out, will go and commit a crime immediately just so they can get back to the comfort of jail. So I can understand to a degree why the police may be willing to overlook this man. But then his wild claims of a house out in the wilderness, or, out in the middle of nowhere in this hidden area under the house that they would hide children. All of these fantastic tales, David, that sound too far to believe. Was that something your group decided to investigate, or was this something that some fringe law enforcement or private detective decided to check out?
No, it was, frankly, one of the benefits of this case for us, and one of the things we like to do as filmmakers, is explore how the media explores a case. A lot of the films we've worked on have been about well-known stories, but they're usually told from the behind the scenes. And I think, the last 30 years we've had, you're able to look back at cases through the eyes of the media and see a lot of things because of how much coverage they got. And when Paul came forward, the story got to America's Most Wanted and John Walsh. So John Walsh took particular interest in this case because of his own background with his own son being abducted and killed, and had a fascination with it. So he put his top people on it, and they said, let's go figure out what this guy Paul really knows, what he's saying. Let's go do it. And, John has taken it upon himself to not just, report and publicize cases, but investigate cases. The work that they do at that show helps solve crimes. And so Paul claimed that there was a house in Colorado where they would take, in rural Colorado, where they would take kids and traffic them. And he says, I'll take you. Let's go. The executive producer of America's Most Wanted, who we talked to at the time, said to us, we all thought we were on this wild goose chase. Next thing we know, we're in Colorado, and exactly where he said this house would be at the bottom of his mountains is this house, this ranch. It's abandoned. No one's there. We go under the house. The cameras are following under the house. You get crazy goosebumps when you're watching this. And he's describing it. Paul, on camera, visibly shudders when he approaches the house. Like he has a visceral, physical reaction to being near this house, that clearly there's something haunting about it to him that seemed pretty hard to fake on camera, unless he, again, is this guy who is a world-class actor and con artist, or he really is an abused kid. And they go underneath the house, and they find all these kids' initials carved in wood beams underneath the house that he shows. And he shows where the kids were tied up and held and bound. And needless to say, it's out of a horror movie, but it's real life. You can't believe that this house really exists, that they really took him there. But again, like so many other things in this case, it ends up a dead end. They could never find the owner who owned the house. They could never sort of put pieces together beyond that.
Now, when you say that, I don't want you to give away, because I think in the movie you say who owned the house or who was believed to own the house. So I don't want you to give that away, because I do think that's a part people need to hear in the story as well. But they could never locate the person, but they knew who it was. Is that what the story was?
Yeah, they had. We don't ever really say, because we don't really know for sure. Mm-hmm. There are names and nicknames for guys. A man who they called the Colonel. This other guy named Sam. That they had sketches of that they thought were involved, but they could never find anybody associated with it. There was a retired corrections officer who had once owned the house, but was no longer around and didn't own it. So they never quite were able to put the pieces together on it. And America's Most Wanted and their team took it as far as they could take it, and basically it ended up as a sort of dead-end case. They had some people calling the show. They had some kids calling the show who claimed to have known Paul, who corroborated things that Paul was saying that they too had been abducted. They put these kids in blackface and they didn't see them, and they showed it's all over the internet if you sort of look up this case. But one of the sort of urban legends around the case was at this ranch they would brand kids with the branding iron used at the ranch.
Which so again sounds far-fetched to the investigators.
That you would do that to another human being, but that it just seemed so evil to do that. But again, when America's Most Wanted aired the piece, a kid called up and said he had the brand, And he went on the show and he lifted up his leg and he had the brand on his leg, stamped in his leg. So again, could he have done it at home and used a hot iron and faked it? Sure, but it all seemed too put together, like these guys were all really going to con America's Most Wanted. There was something too obvious about it to make you think that, too obviously real about it to make you think that it was anything but a legitimate story.
Now you've got one of the world's largest victims advocates in your court. Right. You've got John Walsh, America's Most Wanted, breaking down walls. We'll take a break. That obviously has to open the eyes of local law enforcement. This has to start a new investigation. What happens next? Stay tuned. We'll talk with David Bellinson when we return to True Crime Tuesday. Mondays, the Charlie Whiskey Television Network, the CW, brings you to the front line of drama with the new military series, Valor. 2 Special Ops Army helicopters, 2 Special Ops helicopter pilots breaking boundaries and defying all expectations. Their bravery in the face of impossible odds earned them the Distinguished Flying Cross for valor. But together, they're finding that truth is the first casualty of war. During their last mission, something went wrong. Something no one is talking about. And when they went into the combat zone, not everyone came home. So now they have secrets, but they're also patriots and refuse to leave any man behind. What would you do if you had to break the rules to do what's right? Would you stay grounded and step in line, or go to any lengths to learn the truth? They share secrets, go on clandestine missions, risk life and limb with only each other to depend on. How close would you get to the only person who really knows you? It's the explosive new drama that pushes the boundaries between military discipline and human nature. The new series that's right on target, Valor. New episodes Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, after all new episodes of Supergirl, only on Charlie Whiskey, the CW. This man comes forward, spills his guts, tells everybody law enforcement doesn't take him seriously. John Walsh from America's Most Wanted does. He puts this man to the test, and this guy passes with flying colors. His stories are coming true. Everything he says is turning out to be legitimate. He's given evidence and information to Johnny's mom, telling her about specific things that only that she would know about Johnny that weren't publicized. There's enough here to corroborate. So now that America's Most Wanted has cracked this egg, law enforcement has to swoop in and do the right thing, right?
You would think, but they don't. It sort of goes back to the point. They refused to interview Paul. They felt he was an uncredible witness. They said that, he was sort of diagnosed with having multiple personalities from sort of years of abuse, and they sort of dismissed him. Now, people who study multiple personality disorder know, and this was, I don't want to go off topic, but people who do study multiple personality disorder will understand that it's a trait that can be developed via abuse, that kids who are often abused develop the multiple personality disorder as a protection mechanism. And they also know, the sort of social psychologists and therapists who deal with them know that they often tell the truth, and that they use those personalities to sort of tell the truth. So all these things point to Paul, this guy who came forward to say he was involved, as being as telling the truth, as being legitimate, and yet he's dismissed by law enforcement. So that proved to be quite a wrinkle in the case. And frankly, the media can only do so much. John Walsh can only do so much. He's got to do other shows. He's got to get to other cases. But they did. They did 3 shows on the story. They had a lot of amazing tips that came in. They had, other kids who claimed to be victims of child trafficking who believed Paul and believed that Johnny was out there and still alive come forward to tell their stories. And it sort of opened up this Pandora's box for this sort of weird parallel universe where kids who are abducted and trafficked sort of run with each other in this sort of underground railroad all over the country. So bizarre, to say the least.
Right. It's still... the frustration is unbelievable, David. Again, as a parent and a father, of as many kids as I've got, to think that one of them might be dead is one thing. To think that one of them is still alive and terrified to come home, terrified to come out of hiding because of what they are doing, what they've been forced to do, what their life is like now, and knowing that somebody has come forward to shed light and nobody can do anything about it. You've got John Walsh on your side for this case, and it's still not cracking. What I know you have to stay objective as a filmmaker and reporting.
It became very frustrating.
Right? How is this not a thing, David? How is it not being opened and people jumping to this case and saying, no, baloney, put this crap away, focus on talking to this guy, let's get some information and some leads? Or do you think that she hurt herself with her admission about her own son later on?
Well, twofold. One is, I think by this point, she had become very frustrated and disillusioned with law enforcement. And so she became very adversarial. And then it became an issue with, and I think you've seen this in other cases, with families who've either been sort of adversaries with law enforcement or been frustrated by their own cases, that they end up becoming adversaries and criticizing law enforcement. And then the story becomes about the criticism and not about the case and not about just going out there and finding, her damn son in her own words. And it became about Noreen versus the police. And I think that's where it takes a very unfortunate turn, because I think, the police, with their resources, it's easy to criticize them, but, they're doing what they say they can do. And of course, as a mother, it's never good enough. Until your kid is found, until your kid's brought home, it's not good enough. So when they're not doing the things that you think are so obvious and easy to do, it becomes extremely, extremely frustrating. So she sort of, realized by this point, Paul's come forward, all this sort of, you would think this is sort of the smoking gun in the case, and they're not going to do anything about it. She sort of has to take matters into her own hands. And Paul was part of a civil suit in 97. So a few years after he comes forward, he had been part of a civil suit where he was, suing a man who he had said had abused him. And Noreen was serving as a character witness and sort of attesting to Paul's honesty in relation to Johnny and everything she told about her. And while she was on the witness stand talking to the judge said to her, well, have you ever seen your son, to corroborate any of the stuff Paul said? And lo and behold, she tells the judge that, yes, she has seen her son since he disappeared. And that, sort of, for all, the proverbial blank hit the fan when she said that. And people just couldn't believe it. It sort of became the front page of the newspaper. Noreen claimed she saw her son.
David Bellinson, our guest this evening, as we talk about the documentary Who Took Johnny, as he just revealed, Noreen took the stand in a civil case, and the judge hit her with a question. Have you spoken to your son to corroborate any of this information? And the world was shocked to find out her answer. She claims she has spoken to her son. Can you give us I want people to see the documentary, but just give us a taste of, do you believe this woman's story? Do you believe that he did come forward to her? And can you give us a little taste of what was said if he did?
Yeah. So the context is, as you were saying, Noreen was on the stand being deposed for a civil suit against Paul, and so she said that Johnny had come to visit her, and basically she says that in 1997, and this is all this is online, this is in her book, so it's not so much of a surprise, but she says in 1997 that there was a knock on her door one night, and that she opens it up. There's a weird guy standing there with another guy. And she says that she immediately recognized it as Johnny, now 15 years older, with another guy who wouldn't identify himself. And she claims they came into her house, sat down for an hour and a half, and he proceeded to essentially corroborate everything she thought she had known about what happened to him, that he told her that he had been abducted and that the kids were used and that, he could only get away for a little bit and, his life was in danger and that he'd been forced to do all these things to other kids, alluding to your point earlier where, the kids who are abused then become compromised when they're forced to do other things. That makes it, harder for them to be believable, harder for them to come forward. So he sort of corroborated all of these notions that she had assumed about what had happened to him since then. And then about an hour and a half, after an hour or so, sitting there, he got up and left. And said, I know how to find you. I know how to contact you. And he left. And so Noreen told that story to everybody. Told the newspaper, told it publicly. And needless to say, people didn't believe her. People don't believe her. People who believed her and felt for her all of a sudden, said, now she's crazy. It's gotten to her head. It's completely turned her. So it's hard. For me, it's hard to make any judgments. I certainly think, Noreen believes that someone visited her that night. I certainly think she believes that Johnny visited her that night. It's hard to know what to believe. If you believe that Johnny is still alive, then it's certainly possible that it could have happened. But I think like all sort of difficult stories, difficult true crime stories, this is a story where some things could be believable and some things might not be believable. I mean, when we've done screenings of the films, we have these really intense Q&As after because people have tons of questions. And I always ask the audience, I say, how many, raise your hand if you believe that Johnny was kidnapped and he's not missing. Everybody raises their hands, right? So that right off the bat, nobody believes he just went missing. He was definitely kidnapped. Then I say, how many believe that he was abducted as part of, an organized, ring? Half the audience raises their hand enthusiastically, maybe 3/4 of the audience. And then I say, okay, well, how many people believe that Johnny visited her that night? Yeah, 10% of the audience raises their hands. So, which to me proves an interesting point, which is if you believe that he was abducted as part of a network or as part of something organized, then you believe what Noreen has told you. But at the same time, you might also not believe some of the other things she says. So that's what makes, on the one hand, that's what makes the story fascinating to me as a filmmaker, and it's just a love of stories. But that's also what makes it very frustrating and difficult for anybody who, is interested in investigating the story, thinking about it, talking about it, is that some things could be believable and some things couldn't be believable, but it doesn't make the entire story unbelievable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. We have about 6 minutes left together, and it's going to be hard to cram a lot of information in. But I want to take it down one very weird angle here.
Okay.
We probably comfort ourselves with thinking, the people behind this kind of ring and the people that are taking advantage of these children are dirtbags, scumbags, drug addicts, problem children. But there's a deeper conspiracy. There's a darker ride on this story that who's behind it, and the reason that law enforcement and government officials and people may be shutting this story down is because this goes to a much higher level. Talking about things like the Franklin scandal.
Right.
Can you give us a brief description and understanding to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the best thing to do to talk about that, rather than to get into conspiracies otherwise, is think about the cases that we read about every day. I mean, we know that people who we hold to high standards in society, coaches, clergy, law enforcement, politicians, businessmen, the people, women, people in our society have all been found guilty of child abuse, child sexual abuse, proliferating child pornography. Lots of people in government, lots of people in law enforcement, lots of people in the military, if you just look it up online, have all been sort of arrested, convicted of child abuse, child sexploitation. So we know that the people who engage in this come from all walks of life. They're not just, what we think of as sort of, the worst elements of society.
But talk to me about what happened when you went for Freedom of Information Act. You reached out for this. What happened to you? What were you getting?
For me, and speaking to the point of that idea, and you get into all these tentacles of what happened, you learn as much by what people don't say as what they do say. So, for instance, the FBI, when we asked them to do an interview about this story, they told us they refused to talk about the Johnny Gosch case. So, to me, that seemed a little strange. Right. Why would the FBI not be willing to talk about a 30-year-old cold case of a 12-year-old missing kid? I wasn't asking them about the Panama Papers. I wasn't asking them about Iran-Contra. I wasn't asking them about, Russian hackers or Russian spies. We're talking about a missing kids case. So we filed a Freedom of Information request, and 9 months after filing the request, we got a letter back from the Department of Justice with our material destroyed. They sent back a CD that supposedly had the FOIA info on it, and the CD was cracked and destroyed. We also got a document from them stating that here's our case number to follow up and otherwise. Before we called them and told them that the CD was cracked, we looked at the case file, and the case file written on their own papers didn't even exist in their own database. So again, and when we called them up, they said, okay, you've got to file a new Freedom of Information request. We can't just send you another CD. So again, that spoke to me. What would be why would the FBI make it so difficult for me to file a Freedom of Information request for a 12-year-old missing kids case? So I wasn't looking for conspiracies. We weren't looking for conspiracies. But when you sort of asking these questions, why is everyone making it so difficult to investigate this case? It makes you start to wonder.
There is so many twisted turns in this case, so much behind it. I've got to ask, few minutes left. You've worked on this documentary. You guys have poured your heart and soul into this for numerous years. It's out and available. Have you heard from anybody you believe to have been Johnny Gosch yourself?
Well, I will say I've gotten some strange information sent to me. Strange things have happened. People have reached out to me. Again, but it's you know, I'm not here to make any announcements that we found Johnny or otherwise. But I will say it's a fascinating story when so many people want to come forward to offer clues and offer explanations and offer their resources and help to help solve it and say that they were a part of it. I think that speaks a lot about the case. That what is it about this 30-year-old, cold case about a 12-year-old boy who went missing one day delivering newspapers that's gotten so many people so riled up and so enthralled over the last 30 years.
David, I can't thank you enough for spending an evening with us here, and I will look forward to talking to you on Coast to Coast and fleshing this out even more with more guests and discussing this in the future. We'll keep our audience updated to that, and your documentary will be available on your website. We've got the link up to that. If they go to darknessradio.com under the True Crime Tuesday tab, they'll find it there. Keep up the good work and the good fight, David. We appreciate this.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Everybody, have a good night and, pay attention.
Yes.
Pay attention to what's going on around you.
Thank you for tuning in to Beyond the Darkness, and we hope you enjoyed today's special presentation of True Crime Tuesday. Each Tuesday this month, we'll be handpicking some of our absolute favorite episodes from True Crime Tuesday past, episodes that have not been heard in years. This is your chance to get a little taste of what you can find every week on Patreon with our new True Crime Tuesday podcast. If you haven't already subscribed, it's very easy. Just go to darknessradio.com, click on the True Crime Tuesday banner. It's only $5 per month to subscribe. You can cancel anytime. It'll give you 4 brand new 90 to 120 minute episodes every week. And it gives you access to all of our past archives. We hope you enjoyed the presentation today. We'll be back again next Tuesday with another special edition of Beyond the Darkness True Crime Tuesday right here.